Hi there, and a very warm welcome to Season 4, Episode 3 of PeopleSoup. It's Ross McIntosh here.
Yeah, all of that. It's life, isn't it, Ross, really? Just life for me. I think to live life and to know people and to open your eyes and your ears and your heart to people and life, I think it does just evoke that motivation to be helpful to people because we all suffer. That's the thing. Suffering is a part of life, and sometimes we suffer because of awful things that happen to us, and sometimes we suffer because we kind of choose to do stuff, and that kind of makes us suffer, and sometimes we suffer because of all of the anguish that's just simply going on in our own minds. And I think that's it. Life, if we open ourselves up to it and open ourselves to suffering, life just invites us to want to be helpful and to want to help others, and by doing that, help ourselves.
P-Supers, thanks for tuning in. This week it's part 1 of my chat with Dr. Steindl, clinical psychologist, author, expert in motivational interviewing and compassion-focused therapy, and YouTube influencer. PeopleSoup is an award-winning podcast where we share evidence-based behavioural science in a way that's practical, accessible and fun to nourish your mind to flourish at work. We cover loads more in our chat, including the evolution of Stan's career, his research, his love of motivational interviewing and compassion-focused therapy, and how he combines them in his work. You can also hear him reflect on the evolution of his motivation to help others, and he selects a song that sends shivers up his spine. In other news, reviews are in for part 2 of my chat with Diana Hill. Over on Twitter, Anne Parkinson said, "Absolutely loved this. So much packed into this and so many takeaways, including creating freedom to choose, living a values-aligned life, non-attachment, expanding and rooting, opening the heart, impermanence and falling on purpose. I love the hermit crab analogy. A fantastic listen." Well, thank you so much, Anne, and thanks to everyone who listened, shared and reviewed the episode. It's been a very popular one. As part of Season 4, I'm inviting you to the cinema. The link is now live, and you can bag your free ticket to see Work Songs via the link in the show notes at rossmcintosh.co.uk. We're really proud to be sponsoring a screening of the documentary Work Songs by filmmaker Mark Street from Brooklyn in collaboration with Argo Pictures. Work Songs was finished just months before the pandemic hit. The film examines how workers from all walks of life found meaning in their jobs. The P-Super virtual screening runs from the 21st of May to the 31st of May. You can get your tickets now to watch it in your own time between those dates. It's a kaleidoscopic portrait of the United States at work. Interviews with cab drivers, longshorewomen, a farmer, a barista, and others discuss threats from automation, the gig economy, and the decline of the unions. I found the film to be absolutely captivating. And once you've got your free ticket and watched the documentary, you'll also be able to send in your questions for the director, Mark Street, as he'll be a future guest on the show. If you do enjoy the podcast, I'd love it if you would subscribe, rate and review it. Whatever platform you're on, it helps us amplify our voice and reach more people with stuff that could be useful. If there's an episode you particularly like, why not drop some change into our virtual tip jar? Every £3 is most gratefully received, and you can find the jar over at ko-fi.com/peoplesoup. For now, get a brew on and have a listen to part 1 of my conversation with Stan. Dr. Stan Steindl, welcome to PeopleSoup.
Thank you very much.
It's a joy to have you here. As I said to you, I'm speaking from the home where I grew up. I'm visiting my dad up in rural Northumberland. We think the connection's okay, but fingers crossed. It's pretty miraculous, really, when you think about it. I'm in rural Northumberland in the UK, and you're way over on the other side of the world.
I'm here in Australia, Brisbane, can hardly imagine what it must be like all the way over there, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah, likewise. So Stan, as a P super, you'll be familiar that I have a research department.
I love this.
Sometimes their investigations are better than others, so I'm going to tell you what they found out about you. So they say that Stan has been a registered psychologist and practicing clinical psychologist since 1993 and works full-time in private practice. His PhD examined the relationship between post-traumatic stress disorder and alcohol dependence among people suffering from combat-related trauma. How are we doing so far?
That's completely accurate. I often have in my mind who on earth this research department is. And I imagine little minions, finding things out. But no, that's right. Clinical psychologist.
Yeah. So let me continue, Stan. So it says he has a broad private practice experience working with men, women, adolescents, couples and families. And you also work extensively with war veterans and other sufferers of stress and trauma. Things like motor vehicle accident victims and victims of crime. Your areas of interest include the treatment of anxiety, depression, stress and trauma, alcohol, drug and smoking addictions, work-related stress and adjustment difficulties, grief and loss, and anger management problems. Wow. I've got more, Stan. They found quite a lot. It says he's also got uber skills in motivational interviewing. And you trained in the US in 2007 and is a member of Mint, which sounds like a fabulous organisation to belong to. I'd love just to say that I'm a member of Mint. I don't know what it means, to be honest. And he frequently presents and trains on the topic.
Yes, well, it does sound like a lot, but yes, it's a fairly general clinical practice and working across all of those areas. But the motivational interviewing bit really comes in with working with addictions, and my PhD was with veterans who both had post-traumatic stress disorder and alcohol dependence, and so that really is where the segue is for me with trying to build motivation. MINT stands for the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers. But yes, it is a nice thing to say about oneself, I guess. I'm a member of MINT.
I think it's also, for me, the resonance is it's a word in the northeast, where I'm originally from, up near Newcastle. And if something's really good, you say, well, way man, that's mint. So it has that kind of resonance with me. We're already getting a sense, Stan, of how your experience and your journey in your career has led you to blend different things together. I love it. And I've got some more.
Okay.
It says he's also a hell of a dude in the field of compassion-focused therapy and presents lectures and workshops on this topic. And heck, folks, he's also written a book called The Gifts of Compassion: How to Understand and Overcome Suffering. And I have to give a big shout out to your YouTube channel, which for me is a great source of inspiration and stuff I can nick, to be honest, Stan, which covers all your interests. And you've also got a great series called Compassion in a T-shirt in Session. And spoiler alert, folks, I will be a future guest on that. We've actually recorded it. So that was a very invigorating and fun session we had last week.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you for doing that too. The compassion-focused therapy is my other professional love. Motivational interviewing and compassion-focused therapy. They're my two loves.
Thank you. I've got a little bit more. A clinical consultant and adjunct associate professor at the School of Psychology at the University of Queensland. And you also helped establish the Compassionate Mind Research Group at University of Queensland. And you're involved in research projects on the topic of shame and trauma, compassion, self-compassion, and motivational interviewing. So blimey, Stan, you're a busy lad.
Yes, the Compassionate Mind Research Group at UQ, that was set up by Dr. James Kirby and myself some years ago. James is certainly doing a lot of work in research and so on through UQ. I'm something of a of an amateur researcher, really. But yes, I enjoy some of that as well. It does feel a bit busy, doesn't it? I didn't sleep very well last Monday night, and I wondered whether there's just too much on my mind. But I slept well last night, so I'm good. I'm very, very chirpy today.
Brilliant. I can see that as well, Stan. And there's one last thing they've uncovered. I don't know where they get this from, but they say they have it on good authority, my research department, from a contact in the movie industry, that you're in a short list of 3 candidates to star as the eye candy male lead in the remake of Point Break, 100% adrenaline. Now, as far as I know, Point Break is a surfing movie. Yeah?
Apparently so, yes. My agent hasn't told me about this opportunity yet, but that sounds interesting.
Oh gosh, maybe we're a bit ahead of the curve, Stan, because they say the other people on the shortlist are someone called Hudson Smith and a fella called Pete. And the location could be Point Cartwright Light.
Absolutely. Well, yes, my old schoolmates, Hudson Smith and Peter Cribb, Simon Richardson, Steve Smith. We're sort of something of a surfing gang, I guess. Mind you, it was much more impressive in the 90s when I was slightly younger and fitter. Now it's more, half an hour in the small swell and then we go and get coffee.
Maybe it's a more sort of genteel version of Point Break.
Much more genteel. The anything around 2 foot is probably pretty good. I mean, I'm turning 50 a little bit later this year, Ross. So I have to be careful with my hamstrings and things like that. But yeah, still surfing, and actually tomorrow morning I'm going to a place called Stradbroke Island, where Point Lookout at Stradbroke Island. There's some great surfing to be had over there as well, with that very same crew.
So maybe there'll be news on the film by then.
Yes, we'll see.
Or maybe that news could inspire you chaps to do a sort of your own film. But actually, Stan, I think you've got enough on your to-do list.
I think I'll just do some selfies on the weekend, and that might have to do.
Right, Stan, enough of my nonsense. I wonder if we could just dive into your career a bit, maybe expand on how your career evolved with some maybe key moments. I wonder if you'd share a bit of that with me and the PeopleSoupers.
It's an interesting opportunity to reflect back on that sort of thing. I've kind of told some of these stories, before a little bit, but really what happened was I had a fairly rough year in grade 11, as many of us do, I suppose, and I was exposed to a book called Man's Search for Meaning, which was by Viktor Frankl, and that is probably the first major moment in which I really became interested in psychology and helping people. And I managed to do just enough in high school to then get into a Bachelor of Arts at University of Queensland. And then first year was slightly chaotic in terms of, mainly having fun. But then I started to, get a bit more serious and by fourth year and then the Masters, I was kind of trying a little bit harder. But I worked early on in alcohol and drug services. And so that was a fairly important kind of initiation into the world of trying to be helpful and with people who were facing difficult challenges in their lives, and addiction is a very difficult one to change. On the one hand, there's some really obvious suffering that goes along with addictions, but on the other hand, it often isn't enough to help people change. I remember Professor Bill Miller, who was one of the developers of motivational interviewing, he sort of said that if negative consequences were enough to help people change their addictive behaviours, we wouldn't have addictions because it just comes along with a lot of negative consequences, pain and suffering. And so that was some of my really early work, and it was after that I did my PhD looking at helping combat veterans with PTSD and alcohol dependence. I was really fortunate to have a PhD supervisor, Professor Ross Young, that was also at the University of Queensland, and he really introduced me first of all to motivational interviewing and did a lot of my early training and supervision around MI. And he was something of an MI trainer as well, although I don't think he was a member of Mint back then. But anyway, that really inspired me to further my skills in motivational interviewing. I did a Train the Trainer training with Bill Miller and his colleague Terry Moyers, and that was in about 2007. So I toddled off to Chicago in America and did my MI Train the Trainer training and became a member of Mint. And so, yeah, that was a major turning point for me. It helped in terms of my clinical skills and working with addictions and other health behaviour changes as well. But I also really started to do a lot more training in introductory MI and training advanced MI and going around, at least around the country here in Australia, sort of getting to meet and work with a whole range of people. At one stage there, I was doing a lot of work with the Heart Foundation because, as you can imagine, with the Heart Foundation, it's often a number of the usual suspects, drinking, smoking, diet, exercise. These are some of the common and important areas of health behaviours that we might work with in terms of heart health. So been doing a lot of training in motivational interviewing around the place. And then probably about 2014 went to some workshops by Professor Paul Gilbert and others, and really started to get exposed as well to compassion-focused therapy. And I think it really all started to come together for me. It made a lot of sense. You're working with people who were really suffering from those early years, moving into motivation, trying to work out how can we help to motivate people or to help people find their own motivation to change in a way that alleviates their suffering, and then moving into compassion-focused therapy, which is all about compassion as a motivation. And so there was this sort of coming together of all of these things for me, really, with CFT. And so, yeah, started to receive training in CFT, but also now delivering various workshops and other sessions on CFT. And actually, I try to do this little kind of combo of motivational interviewing for compassion-focused therapy is probably my niche of sorts. That's what I like to work on, because people have a lot of fears, blocks and resistances to compassion. And so they feel ambivalent about it. On the one hand, they know it's a good idea not to be so critical, but on the other hand, they don't want to get too self-pitying. So, motivational interviewing is a great way to help people to navigate that sort of ambivalence as well. And so that's probably brought us up to where I'm at the moment, trying to sort of do that work of MI and CFT and sort of spread the news, the YouTube channel and the book and all these things. That's all about really trying to disseminate what I think is some just rich, important ideas and information to everyone.
Thanks, Dan. I absolutely hear you, and kudos to you for the work you are doing to disseminate. I'm really interested in this intersection and your creativity about combining the motivational interviewing with compassion focused therapy, because I think it hits on one of the things I'm finding in my journey in bringing compassion to organizations. It's that hurdle of, oh mate, here's Ross with his fluffy pink huggy tree type stuff, and it wouldn't really work in an organisation, would it? Because we've got stuff to do. So it really speaks to that for me. And I think it really shines through in your book as well. And we'll come back to that. And what I was really interested in is for our listeners who haven't heard of motivational interviewing, how would you describe it to someone?
Well, the key premise is that if we try to tell people what to do, or we try to convince them to change, or we give them a whole range of logical arguments about, why they should change or that they need to change, the danger is that they will actually just start arguing back. They'll start arguing with us. And so there we are saying, it would be a really good idea for you to start exercising. And then they say, yeah, but I don't have time to start exercising. So we sometimes get caught in that kind of discord, especially health professionals, but it really does relate, I think, to a whole range of scenarios, including in the workplace. The managers who are really trying to motivate their staff only to get these yes buts coming back. And so motivational interviewing is trying to find a way to have a helpful conversation, a conversation that doesn't become discord and resistance, but rather the helper or the listener is finding ways to be evocative. How can I help the other person make their own arguments for change or action or whatever it might be? A good colleague of mine, Helen Menther, she sometimes says, we want to give the other person all the good lines. So sometimes if we think to ourselves, ooh, I really want to tell this person this reason to change or something like that, we need to stop and think, how can I evoke that from them? How can I give them the good lines so that actually they're the ones that are making their own arguments for change? Because, actually, who are we to know best, really? That actually it is up to them, and we want to respect their choices, and we want to really support their autonomy in all of that. So MI really is actually a way to have a conversation with people that evokes the other person's own arguments for change without getting caught up in discord and resistance.
Thank you. And I love that we want them to come up with the good lines.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. And I love the way it respects the context of the person you're working with. They will have a context around them and going on between their ears. And for someone like you or me to say, oh, here's the answer. It doesn't work. I know that as a coach. You know that in all your work. It doesn't tend to work. You tend to get probably more resistance.
It is interesting. Sometimes we're actually tripped up by our own enthusiasm. We feel like, I know what they could do. I know what would help. If they could just do this one thing, everything would be so much better for them. Or, so it's usually not coming from a negative place or a bad place. It's just that we get excited about something. We try to tell them and kind of convince them. And then all of a sudden they're arguing back, and we're like, but this is good stuff. Why aren't you listening to my advice? And so we're wanting to step back from that and really be much more evocative. And of course, in compassion-focused therapy or mindful self-compassion or other compassion-based approaches, we often feel very enthusiastic about compassion and self-compassion and that it's a good idea. But we have to be careful of that dynamic, I think, that people will have their fears, blocks and resistances. And if we come up against those, then actually they'll just convince themselves not to do it. You know, I know what I believe when I hear myself speak. And so if we talk to people and we try to convince them about compassion and self-compassion, and all that does is evokes from them a whole bunch of arguments about why it's not right for them, then that's what they'll be convinced by, is their own arguments against it.
Beautiful. I love the way you describe that. It really resonates with me. And if I wanted to attend one of your trainings as a participant, as someone who's not been trained in motivational interviewing, would that be possible from this side of the globe?
Well, a lot of my training is really done sort of in-house with organisations at the moment. So, for example, just last night I did a webinar with SWPS University in Poland. Dr. Julia Val organised that, and so I had the wonderful opportunity to sort of do some training through online webinar with students there. So there are those sorts of opportunities happening. They tend to be in-house at the moment, though. Next year I've got a really big schedule of training at one of the major health departments here in Australia, and so it tends to be things like that, to be honest.
I'm taking that as not never. I'm taking that the door still may be open. I know no idea how that would work, Stan, but I'd love to be trained by you in motivational interviewing. Maybe I just need to find my way into one of these organisations.
Well, I think there could be opportunities down the road. I have done some workshops for the Compassionate Mind Foundation, for example, and that was a motivational interviewing for compassion-focused therapy. I would love to do more of those, so we'll see. It's possible.
Hey, you heard it here first, folks. Stan, it's great to hear a bit more about your career, and I really see this strong theme of helping others. How did that develop in your life?
Yes, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? It's hard to quite know what contributed to that, to be honest. I come from a long line of medical people on my mother's side. My mum was a GP, a general practitioner, and her mum was a GP, and actually later in her career became more interested in counselling as well. She was more of the Fritz Perls ilk. But she introduced me to Carl Rogers. He gave me the book on becoming a person, and so that was my granny. Her husband, my grandfather, was also a doctor and a urologist, actually. And his father was a doctor, if I remember rightly. And then his father was a educator. He was the one that came out from the UK and came to Australia and was eventually the Vice-Chancellor of UQ. So there's these funny little connection points everywhere. So yeah, there's a kind of a helping, almost helping gene, maybe. I'm not sure, but maybe there's a helping gene that gets passed down the line or something. I didn't get quite the marks to get into medicine, of course, nor do I think I wanted to be a doctor per se. I'm not a big fan of some of the nitty-gritty of medicine. I was much more inspired by the idea of psychology and therapy and being helpful. And reading Viktor Frankl and reading Carl Rogers. I then, as a 19-year-old, was a telephone counsellor at Kids Helpline here in Australia, and did that for a couple of years. And I was always enjoying voluntary work, even back then as a older teenager or younger adult. I used to do some volunteer work at, I guess, what was called a special school at that stage for people with profound intellectual and physical disabilities, and was just drawn to that sort of... Even now, over COVID, I started volunteering for Meals on Wheels, actually, because some of the drivers were of an age where they really had to, themselves lock down. And so to do some driving around and delivering meals to people and that sort of thing, and that sort of felt good. So I'm not really sure, but all of that, sort of plays into it, I guess. And there's also been a number of really important mentors, supervisors along the way. Roger Dooley is probably the fellow here that influenced me as a therapist the most. He's a local private clinical psychologist as well, and he sort of supervised me over a number of years, and we still catch up for peer supervision. So yeah, it's a funny thing to think about, isn't it? And of course, my own emotional journey. There was the stuff in grade 11, and my daughter has a fairly severe medical condition, long-standing problem, which I won't go into in too much detail for her own sake, but suffice to say that it was very challenging, and as an 8-month-old, and from then on, really, they were tough times, and trying to sort of navigate all of that, and there's sort of trauma in that, but there's also growth, that comes through those sorts of experiences. She's now 18 or just about 19, and she's managing her stuff, doing nursing and in second year uni herself now. She doesn't go to UQ, which of course I had to cope with, but she goes to QUT, which is another great uni here in Brisbane. So we had a chuckle about that. But yeah, all of that. It's life, isn't it, Ross, really? Just life for me. I think to live life and to know people and to open your eyes and your ears and your heart to people and life, I think it does just evoke that motivation to be helpful to people, because we all suffer. That's the thing. Suffering is a part of life, and sometimes we suffer because of awful things that happen to us, and sometimes we suffer because we kind of choose to do stuff, and that kind of makes us suffer, and sometimes we suffer because of all of the anguish that's just simply going on in our own minds. And I think that's it. Life, if we open ourselves up to it and open ourselves to suffering, life just invites us to want to be helpful and to want to help others, and by doing that, help ourselves.
Thank you so much for your willingness just to reflect on that rather inelegantly structured question. I really appreciate that, Stan. I think it's really illuminating to hear your openness. Now, Stan, there's a question I ask my guests about a song that they'd use to announce their arrival in a room, whether it's a real room or a virtual room, whether it's work or at home.
Yes, well, as I said to you before we started our recording, part of me would like to say, who let the dogs out?
Which would be a perfectly legitimate choice.
Well, I am a major fan of dogs. I love dogs. I have a chocolate Labrador of my own, and he's one of my best mates, and definitely a source of great comfort and compassion. But no, my favourite song of all time, really, and I always go back to it, is Imagine by John Lennon. I feel like there's so much wisdom there, and this really beautiful invitation to just imagine what life could be. Imagine if we did this, or imagine if we did that. This it just invites us to be curious about perhaps steps we could take, intention that we could set, actions that would actually make for a better time for all of us, a better time on this planet. So if I was to walk into a room and hear that C chord playing on the piano, that would probably, it sends shivers up my spine just thinking about it. So I think that has to be the one that we'll go with.
Brilliant, thank you. And I love the way you reflect on sort of evoking that curiosity in the listener. Imagine if, and then what would you do? It feels very consistent with your whole body of work as well.
Yes, I think so. I think I know you're a big fan of curiosity, and I am very keen on curiosity and creativity and imagination, and trying to think, what next, or what about this, or trying to sort of, discover little things through creativity.
Thank you, Stan. And I'm a big fan of Bruno too, so the more photos the better of him.
Yes, old Bruno, the chocolate Labrador. He's I think he's just on the other side of those doors. He'll be out there waiting patiently, and then he'll be fairly insistent on dinner, I think, shortly.
I don't want to hold up Bruno, so I'm gonna move us on, Stan.
Okay.
And I'd love to really dive into your book, just to learn a bit more about that. The Gifts of Compassion: How to Understand and Overcome Suffering. And I was fortunate enough to read a copy, and I would like to start this segment with my review, if I may.
Oh, yes, please. Love to hear it.
PeopleSoupers, that's it. Part 1 in the bag. You know what they say. Always leave them wanting more. And Part 2 is an absolute cracker. Thanks to Stan for being such a fab guest. You'll find the links to his website and the book on the show notes, as well as his YouTube channel. If you like this episode or the podcast, could I invite you to share it with one other person? I'm really keen to spread the behavioural science and skills with more people. Of course, a subscription, follow, rating or review are also very much appreciated. The show notes for this episode are at rossmcintosh.co.uk, and this includes links to a few different platforms. I love to hear from you, PeopleSoupers, whether you're a regular or whether this is your first listen. You can get in touch at peoplesoup.pod@gmail.com. On Twitter, we are at PeopleSoupPod. On Instagram at people.soup. And on the Facebook, we are at PeopleSoupPod. Thanks to Andy Glenn for his spoon magic and Alex Engelberg for his vocals. And to you for listening. Look after yourselves, PeopleSoupers, and bye for now.
Something of a surfing gang, I guess. Mind you, it was much more impressive in the 90s when I was slightly younger and fitter. Now it's more, half an hour in the small swell and then we go and get coffee.